Professor Nathaniel Brooks thought humiliating the quiet woman in the gray cardigan would earn him another round of applause from the packed lecture hall. But before that afternoon ended, his own students would watch his reputation collapse in absolute silence. The massive auditorium at Princeton Heights University buzzed with anticipation beneath rows of glowing chandelier lights as some of the brightest graduate students in the country filled the tiered seating with laptops, notebooks, and whispered conversations about advanced quantum mathematics. At the center of it all stood Brooks himself, the university's celebrated mathematical prodigy, a man whose published theories had earned international acclaim and whose arrogance had grown alongside his reputation. His tailored navy suit fit perfectly beneath the stage lights, while his silver-rimmed glasses reflected the giant equation projected behind him across a 20-foot digital board. Every movement he made carried the confidence of a man who believed he was the smartest person in every room he entered. And usually he was. Today, Brooks announced confidently, pacing across the polished wooden platform, "We're discussing a theorem so complex that only a handful of minds in this country fully understand its implications." Several students nodded immediately, eager to impress him. Others typed frantically, as if every word from his mouth carried sacred importance. Near the back of the hall, however, one woman sat quietly unnoticed by almost everyone around her. Evelyn Carter kept her eyes lowered toward a worn leather notebook resting in her lap. At 39 years old, she looked completely out of place among the ambitious graduate students surrounding her. Her faded gray cardigan hung loosely over a plain white blouse, and her chestnut hair was tied back in a simple braid that made her appear older than she actually was. She carried herself carefully, almost invisibly, like someone accustomed to moving through crowded spaces without being acknowledged. Most people at the university barely noticed Evelyn at all. To them, she was simply the evening library assistant who reorganized bookshelves after classes ended and quietly cleaned abandoned study rooms long after midnight. Students walked past her every day without making eye contact. Professors forgot her name seconds after hearing it. And that was exactly how Evelyn preferred it. But while Brooks confidently filled the room with complicated formulas and polished academic language, Evelyn's eyes slowly narrowed at the enormous equation glowing across the screen. Something about it felt wrong. Not entirely wrong, just incomplete. Her fingers tightened around her pen as Brooks continued speaking with theatrical confidence. The boundary conditions remain perfectly stable under recursive transformation, he declared proudly while underlining a section of the equation with dramatic flair. Which is why no competing model has ever disproven my findings. The room filled with murmurs of admiration. Brooks smiled slightly, enjoying every second of it. Then Evelyn quietly raised her hand. The movement was so subtle that at first nobody noticed. But when Brooks finally looked toward the back row and saw the plainly dressed woman sitting among his graduate students, his expression tightened almost instantly. "Yes?" he asked, his voice already carrying irritation. Evelyn swallowed softly before speaking. "I'm sorry," she said carefully, her voice calm but hesitant. "Wouldn't the recursive boundary collapse under asymmetrical variable pressure in the fourth sequence?" The entire auditorium went still. Fingers froze above keyboards. A few students turned in confusion toward the woman in the cardigan. Brooks stared at her without blinking. Then slowly, a smile crept across his face. Not the smile of curiosity. The smile of a man who had just found someone he intended to embarrass. The smile spreading across Professor Brooks's face carried the cold satisfaction of a man who believed he had complete control over the room. Several graduate students exchanged amused glances while others leaned back in their seats, already anticipating what they assumed would become an awkward public embarrassment. Brooks slowly removed his glasses, polishing them with calculated patience as the giant equation continued glowing behind him like a monument to his own ego. "That is a very interesting question," he said finally, his voice dripping with condescension, "especially coming from someone outside the department." Quiet laughter scattered across the auditorium. Evelyn immediately lowered her eyes. She already regretted speaking. She should have stayed invisible. That was the safest way to survive places like this. But Brooks was not finished. "Tell me," he continued while stepping closer to the edge of the stage, "which doctoral program are you enrolled in?" Evelyn hesitated for half a second too long. The students noticed immediately. "I am not part of the mathematics department," she answered softly. Brooks folded his arms. "No." Another pause. "Then what exactly is your role here at Princeton Heights?" Evelyn's fingers tightened around her notebook. "I work in the university library during evening hours." The laughter became louder this time. Not cruel enough to sound openly vicious, but sharp enough to sting. A blonde graduate student near the front whispered something to his friend, and both smirked openly. Brooks nodded slowly as though everything suddenly made perfect sense. A librarian. He repeated the word carefully, stretching it just enough for the audience to absorb the humiliation. "Well, that certainly explains the confidence. Libraries do contain many mathematics books after all." More laughter echoed through the hall. Evelyn felt heat rising into her cheeks, but she remained still. Years earlier, moments like this would have shattered her. But life had already taught her that humiliation was rarely loud at first. It arrived quietly, in smirks, in dismissive glances, in people deciding who you were before you ever spoke. Brooks turned back toward the digital board and tapped the equation dramatically with his marker. "Since you seem to believe there is a flaw in my theorem," he said, "perhaps you would care to explain your reasoning to the room." The invitation was not genuine. Everyone could hear it. The students shifted eagerly in their seats. Some already reached for their phones beneath their desks. A public failure inside Brooks's symposium would become instant graduate gossip. Across campus, Evelyn opened her mouth slightly, then stopped herself. Every instinct told her to stay seated. "No pressure, of course," Brooks added with a thin smile that made several students laugh again. "Unless the library has suddenly become a center for advanced quantum mathematics." The room erupted harder this time. Even some faculty members smiled awkwardly. Only one person did not react. Near the front row sat Professor Amelia Reed from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, one of the most respected mathematical theorists in the country. Unlike the others, Amelia was not laughing. She watched Evelyn carefully instead, her sharp blue eyes studying the woman in the gray cardigan with growing curiosity. Because Evelyn had not reacted the way embarrassed people usually reacted. She had not become defensive. She had not argued. She had not tried to prove herself. Instead, she looked at the equation again. And for the briefest moment, Amelia noticed something strange in her expression. Recognition. Not confusion. Not panic. Recognition. Brooks noticed the silence coming from Amelia's section and mistook it for support. His confidence grew instantly. "Come now," he called out while gesturing toward the stage. "You raised the concern publicly. Surely you can elaborate publicly." Evelyn stared down at her notebook. The room waited. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, while dozens of eyes pressed against her from every direction. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, Evelyn Carter stood up from her seat. Evelyn could feel every pair of eyes following her as she stepped into the narrow aisle between the rows of seats. The soft sound of her shoes against the polished auditorium floor echoed far louder than it should have in the heavy silence hanging over the room. A few students exchanged amused smiles while others leaned forward eagerly, waiting for the inevitable collapse they were certain was coming. Professor Brooks stepped aside from the center stage with theatrical politeness, one hand extended toward the massive digital board glowing with equations. "Please," he said smoothly. "The floor is yours." Evelyn stopped several feet from the board. Up. Close. The equation stretched across nearly the entire screen, layered with recursive sequences, asymmetrical transformations, and dense notations that would intimidate almost anyone outside elite academic circles. Brooks folded his arms confidently beside her, clearly enjoying the tension building throughout the hall. "Take your time," he added loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Quantum mathematics can be overwhelming without formal training." Quiet laughter spread again. Evelyn said nothing. She simply stared at the equation. And then something changed. The nervousness in her posture slowly disappeared. Her breathing steadied. The noise of the room seemed to fade away from her entirely. Amelia Reed noticed it first. The subtle transformation in Evelyn's eyes. People pretending to understand mathematics usually looked at equations with uncertainty. Evelyn looked at them the way a pianist looked at familiar sheet music. Brooks handed her a marker with a smirk that carried almost paternal mockery. "Let us see what the library has taught you," he said. Evelyn accepted the marker gently. Her fingers trembled slightly at first. The auditorium remained perfectly still. Somewhere near the back row, a student quietly whispered, "This is going to be painful." Another student chuckled under his breath. Evelyn lowered the marker toward the board, but paused before writing anything. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying Brooks's theorem with careful precision. Then, very softly, she spoke. "You assumed stability too early." Brooks's smile faded just slightly. "Excuse me." Evelyn pointed toward the fourth sequence in the recursive chain. "The asymmetrical pressure compounds here," she explained quietly. "Not immediately. 3 layers later." Several students frowned in confusion. Brooks gave a dismissive laugh. "That would only happen if the variable relationship became unstable under rotational recursion." Evelyn nodded once. "Exactly." The room fell silent again. Brooks's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "That is mathematically impossible," he replied sharply. Evelyn finally raised the marker to the board. "No," she said calmly. "It only looks impossible because the compression sequence was calculated backward." And then she began writing. At first, the audience barely reacted. Most expected random symbols or nervous hesitation. But within seconds, keyboards stopped clicking. Evelyn moved with shocking confidence. Every line connected flawlessly into the next. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing, no uncertainty. The equations flowed across the board with smooth precision, elegant and terrifyingly advanced. Amelia Reed slowly sat forward in her chair. Brooks's smirk vanished completely now. Evelyn rewrote the transformation sequence from a completely different angle, simplifying calculations that Brooks himself had presented as impossibly complex. Murmurs spread across the hall. One graduate student quietly lowered his phone, no longer recording for amusement. Another stared at the board with widening eyes. Evelyn continued writing in complete silence except for the soft scratching sound of the marker moving across glass. The atmosphere inside the auditorium had changed entirely. Nobody was laughing anymore. Even Brooks had stopped speaking. His eyes moved rapidly between Evelyn's equations and his own original theorem. And for the first time that afternoon, uncertainty began creeping into his face. The deeper Evelyn moved into the equation, the more the atmosphere inside the auditorium transformed from amusement into disbelief. Students who had spent years studying under Professor Brooks now stared at the board with growing confusion because the woman they had dismissed as a quiet library assistant was navigating one of the most advanced mathematical structures they had ever seen with impossible ease. Brooks attempted to recover his composure, stepping closer beside her while forcing a tight smile back onto his face. "Interesting approach," he said carefully. "Although unnecessary complications often create the illusion of insight." Evelyn did not even look at him. She continued writing calmly, her focus absolute. "It is only complicated if the theorem begins from the wrong assumption," she replied softly. A ripple of whispers moved through the hall. Brooks's jaw tightened. He quickly grabbed another marker and stepped toward a separate section of the board. "Then perhaps," he said sharply, "you would care to explain how your adjustment avoids recursive collapse during rotational inversion." Several students nodded immediately, recognizing the trap. It was an advanced concept buried deep within postdoctoral theory, the kind of challenge designed to expose fraud instantly. Brooks turned toward the audience with renewed confidence. He believed he had cornered her now. Evelyn finally paused. The room became perfectly still again. Even the faint hum of laptop fans seemed louder beneath the crushing silence. Then Evelyn slowly looked toward the section Brooks had written. Her eyes moved across the symbols once, twice, and then something happened that made Amelia Reed sit completely upright in her chair. Evelyn smiled very slightly, not arrogantly, not triumphantly, but with quiet recognition, like someone seeing an old memory return. "You are still calculating compression from linear orientation," she said. Brooks frowned immediately. "That is the standard model." Evelyn nodded gently. "That is why the instability keeps appearing." Before Brooks could answer, Evelyn erased 3 small sections of his correction with one smooth motion. Gasps quietly spread across the hall. No one erased Professor Brooks's equations. No one even touched them. But Evelyn rewrote the structure entirely, transforming a dense wall of impossible notation into something strangely elegant. Simpler, cleaner, smarter. The students watched in stunned silence as the impossible equation suddenly began making sense in ways Brooks himself had never explained before. One student whispered under his breath, "How is she doing that?" Another slowly closed his laptop completely. Brooks stared at the board now without speaking. His confidence was slipping visibly. "That sequence does not exist in published research," he said finally, though his voice no longer sounded certain. Evelyn stepped back slightly. "No," she answered quietly, "because it was abandoned 15 years ago after most researchers concluded it could not stabilize under asymmetrical recursion." Amelia Reed's eyes widened. Instantly, Brooks looked at her sharply, suddenly aware that something was happening far outside his control. Evelyn continued calmly. "The original framework was not wrong. The orientation was." The room had gone completely silent now. Not a single student moved. Brooks stared back at the equations covering the board, while realization slowly began creeping across his face. He recognized the methodology. Not from journals. Not from conferences. From somewhere much older. Somewhere buried deep in academic history. Amelia Reed rose slowly to her feet. The movement alone caused dozens of students to turn toward her immediately, because Amelia Reed never stood during presentations unless something extraordinary was happening. Her voice cut through the silence carefully. "That rotational correction," she said quietly while staring at Evelyn's work. "There were only 3 people in the country researching that model." Brooks's face lost color. Evelyn lowered the marker slowly into her hand. Amelia took one step forward, her eyes locked completely on the woman in the gray cardigan. "Who are you?" she asked softly. And for the first time since walking into the auditorium, Evelyn Carter looked genuinely unsettled. For several long seconds, Evelyn did not answer Amelia Reed's question. The enormous lecture hall remained frozen in complete silence, while dozens of students looked back and forth between the respected professor from Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the quiet woman standing beside the board covered in impossible mathematics. Brooks attempted to regain control of the room before the silence buried him completely. "Professor Reed," he said quickly, forcing out a strained laugh, "surely you are not suggesting this woman has any serious connection to advanced rotational theory." But Amelia did not even look at him. Her eyes remained fixed on Evelyn. 15 years ago, Amelia said slowly, there was a Princeton doctoral candidate who published an unpublished correction model involving asymmetrical recursion. Murmurs immediately spread across the auditorium. Brooks's expression darkened. Amelia continued carefully, almost as if she were speaking to herself now. "The work disappeared before the final review board could archive it. Most people assumed the research was abandoned." Evelyn lowered her gaze toward the floor. "It was," she answered softly. Brooks stepped forward immediately. "Enough of this," he snapped, his patience finally beginning to crack. "This symposium is not some theatrical guessing game." But the authority in his voice no longer carried the same weight it had an hour earlier. The students could hear it now. The uncertainty, the irritation, the fear creeping beneath his composure. Amelia ignored him again. "What was your dissertation title?" she asked Evelyn quietly. Evelyn hesitated. Her fingers tightened around the marker as though she regretted every second of this moment. "Recursive stabilization through nonlinear compression," she answered at last. The reaction inside the auditorium was immediate. Several older faculty members suddenly looked up from their seats with visible shock. One professor whispered something under his breath, while another stared at Evelyn as if seeing a ghost. Brooks froze completely, because he recognized the title instantly. Everyone serious in theoretical mathematics recognized it. The dissertation had become something close to academic legend after its mysterious disappearance 15 years earlier. Some believed the candidate behind it had been on the verge of redefining modern quantum theory. Others believed the work was mathematically impossible and quietly erased before publication. Brooks swallowed hard. "That dissertation was written by Evelyn Carter," he said slowly. "The youngest doctoral researcher Princeton ever accepted into advanced theoretical mathematics." No one moved. Evelyn said nothing. Brooks stared at her now with growing disbelief as pieces began connecting inside his mind. The age, the methodology, the impossible elegance of her calculations. The room felt suddenly smaller beneath the crushing realization spreading through the audience. One graduate student quietly whispered, "No way." Amelia Reed stepped closer, her expression softening for the first time. You disappeared, she said carefully. Evelyn finally looked up again. There was no pride in her face, no satisfaction, only exhaustion. My son became sick, she answered quietly. The room remained silent. I left before the dissertation defense. Brooks blinked slowly. Evelyn's voice stayed calm, but something fragile hid beneath every word now. After he passed away, mathematics stopped mattering. Several students lowered their eyes immediately. The arrogance that had filled the room earlier began dissolving into discomfort. Shame settled across the auditorium like heavy fog. Brooks looked toward the board again, then back at Evelyn, unable to fully process what had just happened. The woman he had mocked publicly was not merely intelligent. She was someone whose work had once terrified the highest levels of academic mathematics. Evelyn gently placed the marker onto the podium beside her. I should go, she said softly. But before she could step away, Brooks suddenly looked back toward the equations covering the board. His face changed again. Confusion replaced humiliation, then concern. Slowly, he stepped closer to the final sequence Evelyn had written. His eyes widened slightly as he re-examined his own theorem beneath her corrections. And in that terrifying moment, Nathaniel Brooks realized the problem was far worse than being embarrassed in public. Evelyn had not simply corrected his work. She had exposed a flaw capable of destroying the research he had built his entire career upon. Professor Brooks stepped closer to the digital board as though drawn there against his will. The confidence that once filled his posture had disappeared completely now, replaced by the rigid tension of a man desperately trying to convince himself he was still in control. His eyes moved rapidly across Evelyn's corrections, rechecking calculations he had defended publicly for nearly 5 years. The auditorium remained silent except for the faint hum of the overhead lights and the occasional nervous shifting of students in their seats. Brooks grabbed his marker again. No, he muttered under his breath while scribbling through one section of the theorem. That cannot be correct. Evelyn stood quietly near the podium, her hands folded calmly in front of her. She no longer looked intimidated. In fact, she barely looked interested in humiliating him at all, which somehow made the moment even worse. Brooks recalculated the sequence again with increasing urgency. Every line led him back to the same horrifying conclusion. The instability was real. Worse than real. It had been hiding beneath the foundation of his theorem the entire time. One graduate student near the front slowly removed his glasses and whispered, "Oh my God." Another stared at the board with his mouth slightly open. They were beginning to understand what this meant. If Evelyn was right, then Brooks's celebrated model for quantum compression was fundamentally flawed. Years of published research, international lectures, academic awards, funding grants, all built on unstable mathematics. Brooks suddenly turned back toward Evelyn. "Why did nobody catch this before?" he demanded, though his voice sounded less angry than desperate now. Evelyn met his eyes calmly. "Because your simplification works temporarily," she explained softly. "The collapse does not appear until the fourth recursive cycle." Brooks swallowed hard. Amelia Reed stepped closer to the board, studying Evelyn's equations carefully. "Which means every long-term projection based on this theorem eventually destabilizes," she said quietly. The room went completely still again. Brooks's face lost even more color. Several faculty members exchanged deeply uncomfortable looks. One older professor slowly sat back in his chair as realization settled over him. "The Federal Quantum Research Initiative," he whispered. Brooks looked away immediately. Evelyn noticed the reaction. "Your theorem was submitted to the National Simulation Program?" she asked softly. Brooks did not answer right away. That silence was answer enough. The atmosphere inside the auditorium shifted from embarrassment into something much heavier now. Fear. Because this was no longer about one arrogant professor being corrected publicly. The flaw reached far beyond Princeton Heights University. Brooks rubbed a hand across his forehead before finally speaking again. "The model passed every institutional review." Evelyn nodded, sympathetically, "because nobody tested the fourth sequence under asymmetrical load expansion." Amelia Reed looked back toward Evelyn slowly. "Except you." Evelyn lowered her gaze. "I discovered the instability 15 years ago," she admitted quietly. "That was why I withdrew the dissertation." Murmurs swept across the auditorium again. Brooks stared at her in disbelief. "You abandoned revolutionary research because of a theoretical flaw?" Evelyn's expression softened slightly. No, she answered quietly. I abandoned it because my son was dying, and suddenly proving I was the smartest person in the room stopped mattering. The words hit the auditorium harder than any equation she had written all afternoon. Several students looked down immediately. Even Brooks seemed unable to respond. The silence stretching through the hall now felt completely different from before. Not tense, not mocking, reflective, ashamed. Brooks slowly looked back toward the board one final time. For the first time in years, he saw his own work exactly as it truly was. Incomplete, fragile, human. His shoulders lowered slightly beneath the harsh auditorium lights. Then, after several long seconds, Nathaniel Brooks did something none of his students had ever seen before. He stepped away from the board, looked directly at Evelyn Carter, and quietly said, "I owe you an apology." Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed loudly. Because moments like this almost never happened in rooms built on ego and prestige. Evelyn studied him silently for a moment before answering. "No," she said softly. "You owe your students humility." Evelyn Carter stepped back from the board, allowing the room to adjust to the magnitude of what had just occurred. Every student and faculty member present was now caught between disbelief and awe, their previous murmurs of amusement replaced by careful, attentive silence. Amelia Reed took a slow breath, her eyes scanning the corrections and reorganized sequences Evelyn had applied to the theorem. "This," she said softly, almost to herself, "is not just an adjustment. It is a complete rethinking of rotational stability." Brooks's posture stiffened as the weight of the realization settled on him fully. He had believed he controlled the room, that his lecture, his theorem, and his reputation were unshakable. Now, every calculation, every claim he had made for half a decade was being re-examined under the precise lens of Evelyn's insight. She did not move quickly or theatrically. There were no grand gestures, no display of superiority. She simply stood there, quiet and steady, letting the evidence speak for itself. Students began to lean forward in their seats, some whispering to neighbors in hushed tones, "She is extraordinary," or "How did we not see this before?" Brooks looked down at the lines Evelyn had written, tracing each connection with a finger that trembled slightly. Each sequence confirmed the flaw he had overlooked, a subtle instability that had compounded through every layer of his original work. Amelia Reed finally broke the quiet. "You must have anticipated this outcome," she said, directing her question toward Evelyn. Evelyn nodded faintly. "I did," she answered, her voice calm, yet carrying the weight of years of careful study. "The flaw is obvious if one considers the long-term recursive expansion under asymmetrical constraints." Brooks's eyes widened. The room seemed to shrink around him as the implications struck deeply. Funding approvals, published papers, lectures abroad. Every accolade now required careful reconsideration. He realized that his authority in this hall was no longer intact. Evelyn's quiet precision had dismantled it entirely. Several students recorded the moment with their phones, though not out of disrespect. They knew this was history being made, a rare demonstration of genius quietly revealed. Some faculty members rose from their seats to examine the board more closely, nodding subtly as they absorbed the validity of Evelyn's calculations. The auditorium, once filled with nervous chatter and suppressed laughter, had transformed into a chamber of hushed recognition, each person processing the intellectual reversal in their own way. Brooks finally stepped away from the board, running a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration and disbelief that contradicted the forced politeness he had attempted. Moments earlier, Amelia Reed turned her full attention toward Evelyn, her expression now one of admiration tempered with professional respect. "You have done what I feared even the brightest graduate students could not," she said. Evelyn's gaze remained lowered slightly, her calm demeanor unbroken. The silence was profound, the magnitude of the reversal settling over the room like a tangible weight. Every person present understood that the quiet librarian, the woman who had been invisible for so long, had just redefined their understanding of what was possible. No applause had yet erupted. No words could capture the immediate shock and awe. It was a pause heavy with realization, an unspoken acknowledgement that intellect, patience, and subtle mastery had conquered arrogance in its most public form. Brooks finally spoke, his voice low and strained. I misjudged you entirely. Evelyn merely nodded, letting the moment linger, allowing the room to absorb that the quietest voices often carry the deepest truths. The students whispered, some in excitement, some in stunned reflection, and Amelia Reed finally stepped forward to place her hand lightly on Evelyn's shoulder, a silent recognition that in this room, for this day, greatness had quietly, irrevocably asserted itself. Evelyn Carter finally allowed herself a subtle breath as she glanced across the room, observing the stunned faces of students and faculty alike. Every person present was caught between astonishment and respect, realizing that the quiet library assistant had single-handedly recalibrated a theorem long considered untouchable. Professor Brooks, still standing near the digital board, seemed rooted in place, his eyes scanning the lines Evelyn had written with disbelief. Amelia Reed, her expression composed but undeniably impressed, stepped forward once more. "This is remarkable," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the still auditorium. "The methodology alone is elegant, precise, and completely defensible." Whispers spread as students began to murmur among themselves, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others leaning closer to their notes to capture the details. The subtle weight of Evelyn's presence filled the room. She did not speak loudly, did not gesture grandly. Her authority came from knowledge, calm precision, and the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years mastering her craft away from public scrutiny. Brooks finally straightened, though the stiffness in his posture betrayed his unease. "I have never encountered such thoroughness," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, the words heavy with reluctant admiration. Several faculty members, previously silent, now approached the board to examine the work themselves, nodding subtly as they realized the depth and accuracy of Evelyn's corrections. Even the graduate students who had been ready to film her failure now leaned forward with rapt attention, captivated by the clarity and insight of her calculations. Amelia Reed looked down at Evelyn, a trace of a smile appearing for the first time. "You have redefined our understanding of this theorem," she said softly, her tone carrying a mixture of awe and respect. Evelyn offered a modest nod, her expression composed, almost unreadable. "It was simply a matter of perspective," she replied quietly. Brooks's eyes darted between Evelyn and Amelia, the enormity of the situation sinking in. Every accolade he had earned, every lecture he had delivered, now seemed fragile in comparison to the quiet authority this woman held in her mastery of the subject. A low murmur began spreading through the students, a mixture of admiration, disbelief, and the slow dawning realization that a quiet presence could wield extraordinary influence without spectacle or overt demonstration. Evelyn stepped slightly back, allowing the room to absorb what had just occurred. The faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead seemed louder in the charged silence. She had not shouted. She had not demanded attention. And yet, in that calm, precise, deliberate way, she had earned it. Professor Brooks, finally breaking the paralyzing shock, looked down at the board one last time, his gaze lingering over every line of her work. His posture slackened slightly as a deep, contemplative silence settled over the auditorium. Every person present, from students to seasoned faculty, now shared the same recognition. Evelyn Carter, the quiet, unassuming library assistant, had demonstrated a level of intellect and composure that none present had anticipated. And as the soft light reflected across the polished wooden floor, it seemed clear to everyone that the room would never forget the quiet brilliance that had just walked through it, leaving a lasting impression of mastery, humility, and an entirely new respect for the power of subtle intelligence. Evelyn Carter finally lowered her marker completely and stepped back, allowing the lecture hall to absorb the full extent of what had just occurred. The students remained frozen in a mix of awe and disbelief, their eyes glued to the board where equations that had once seemed insurmountable now flowed seamlessly in precise, elegant patterns. Brooks stood silently, his chest rising and falling slowly as he processed the humiliation, yet beneath it, a reluctant respect began to form. Amelia Reed, still at the front, adjusted her glasses and looked toward the audience with a subtle nod, silently acknowledging that this demonstration had redefined the standard for mastery in their field. A few faculty members approached cautiously, murmuring to each other about the depth and accuracy of Evelyn's work, each realization hitting harder than the last as they considered the implications. The atmosphere in the room was heavy with reflection, the usual chatter and hurried note-taking replaced by hushed contemplation. Students whispered quietly to one another, some sharing frantic glances, others sketching hurried diagrams to capture the methodology they had just witnessed. Evelyn herself remained calm, her posture relaxed but composed, as if the storm of astonishment swirling around her did not concern her at all. Her eyes met Brooks's briefly, and in that silent exchange, she communicated neither triumph nor malice, only quiet authority born from knowledge and experience. Brooks shifted slightly, his voice low, barely audible. "I had no idea." His hands moved over the empty space beside him as if trying to grasp the precision she had displayed, and for a moment, he seemed smaller than he had in years. Amelia Reed finally stepped closer, her voice firm yet gentle. "The level of insight you demonstrated here is extraordinary. It will influence more than this symposium. The implications stretch across ongoing research and publication." Evelyn nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if the weight of recognition mattered less than the act itself. She had solved the problem not for fame, nor for applause, but because she had always pursued understanding quietly and meticulously. Around the room, students began to lean forward in anticipation, their minds racing to reconcile the woman they had dismissed as a quiet assistant with the intellectual force she had revealed. The soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the faint scratching of pencils against paper created a subtle backdrop to the profound silence that had settled over the space. Brooks turned to glance at Amelia Reed once more, his previous confidence stripped away, replaced by introspection and acknowledgement of the depth of Evelyn's talent. Slowly, he took a deep breath and exhaled, allowing the weight of humility to settle in the room. Every person present now understood something essential. Brilliance is not always loud. Mastery does not always demand recognition, and the quietest voice can echo louder than the most confident proclamation. Evelyn's gaze swept across the auditorium, taking in the awe, the reconsideration, the quiet respect, and then she stepped toward the exit. No fanfare, no dramatic gesture, just the calm assertion of someone who had long understood her own worth. Behind her, Brooks's eyes lingered on the board, the reality of what had just occurred sinking in fully. The room had gone silent, a perfect stillness that carried both reverence and the recognition that they had all just witnessed an intellect that could not be contained by appearances, titles, or assumptions. And as Evelyn left the auditorium, her calm, steady presence left an indelible mark on every person in the room, a reminder that true mastery often walks quietly, waiting for the world to finally notice.